Jan,
Yep,
will you be recording the session?
it's already being recorded.
And you'll inform everybody that it's recorded?
Yeah, I'll repeat it also. Thanks to everybody who's joining the meeting. We'll give it a minute or so more to let more folks come in, and then I'll perform introductions. One more minute. Okay, I think we'll get started. Well, thanks to everyone who's come in and joined the meeting today. It's going to be a publications board report, and so the folks that are going to be talking about this is Scott Delman from ACM, and we have Joseph Constant and Jack Davidson from the Pubs board that will be talking through this. Just to let you know, this is being recorded and it will be made available for folks to access later. Also, the way we're going to be handling the meeting is that Scott and Jack and Joseph will be giving the presentation. You'll notice in the interface there is a Q&A section there. If you would click on that and enter your questions there, and then Claire will be taking in those questions and we'll be answering those typically at a good break point so we can get those questions in and get those answered. And so please go ahead and do that. If you have some other issues, you can send a chat to myself or Claire, and we can help answer those questions offline. And I think with that, I will turn it over to the Pubs board.
Yeah, so I will kick this off. Joe Constant, always good to be with the SIG governing board, which is where I started much of my service within ACM. A little bit of introduction as to what we're doing today and why, and then we're going to dive into some of the numbers. First, the what. We're taking a look at ACM's publications finances in a way that, in general, has mostly been seen inside headquarters and in looking at things like rate setting and budgeting, but has not in the past, as far as I know, been presented to the membership broadly. And Jack and Scott and I have been in the process of putting this together in the form of an article to publish to our membership and effectively to the public in CACM. But we wanted the leaders of ACM, which is all of you, to have a look at it first and frankly to get your reactions as we fine tune this and tinker and make sure you're aware of everything that we're now aware of. This is the result of a lot of effort, much of it from ACM's executive staff, financial leadership, the directors of ACM's various departments, trying to figure out what publications really cost. And I say that because there's been a lot of publicity lately about what publications do or should cost. Some of that has come out of looking at our annual report, which most of you know has a department by department view, but not a cross-functional view or an overhead related view. Some of it has been the push on open access and what fair charges are. And a lot of it has been our effort to move towards a new relationship model with our library customers and them wanting to know, well, what are your books like so that we understand whether you're charging us fair prices. And so what you're going to see here is the result of that effort coming together to look at calendar 2019. We did a calendar year rather than a fiscal year because the publications revenues typically run on calendar years, and that seemed like an easier way to pull things together. Any effort like this has a lot of decisions that are made along the way. If you looked at the article we sent out, you'll see what most of those are. I think the key ones that you need to be aware of at this level are that we focused on things that were substantial. We're not trying to break things down to $200 for this, $150 for that. We're looking at expense items at large chunks and aggregating the smaller ones. We're still making sure the smaller ones are there, but we're lumping them together. We did this with an indirect basis in there, which involved tallying all of the things that are not in the publications budget, the digital library costs, but the things that are in core units that had to be allocated out: human resources, space, utilities, marketing and communications, management. All of those things had to be allocated among the various functions of ACM, among conferences and SIGs, education, publications, membership, and other areas. A couple of other key things: we didn't allocate any membership fees for publications because those fees are really set separately and they're dealt with separately. And we didn't try to break down every small activity. We really focused on the three big lines of business, the three big lines being journals, magazines, and conference proceedings. As part of that, as we'll say in more detail later, when we allocate costs, we're allocating them to the things that we think are the units that you can actually measure revenue against, typically full papers, as opposed to breaking things out to a poster abstract or other things like that. Well, with that as sort of an introduction, Scott, if you'll go to the next slide, let me just, I said a lot of these things. We can keep going to the slide after that. Let's just take financials at a glance. We're going to take it in two parts. What this slide shows you is two things. Where is our expense based? And our expenses, as you can see, are broken into those core lines of business, magazines and conference proceedings being the largest direct lines of business, followed by journals in terms of expense, but also a large expense line around the digital library, which later we'll allocate out and share. The other thing that's in here, and we'll break all of these down in a little while, is the cost of sales. Because of the way that ACM sells our subscriptions, we don't have a lot of sales staff in-house. We contract with sales agents either on a commission basis or on a time basis around the world to sell the digital library to the roughly 2,800 universities and companies that subscribe to it around the world. It doesn't make sense for us to have an immense sales organization, but that does mean we have a direct cost of sales that's not primarily people, it's primarily agencies and other things. You can see some other small costs that are in here. We're not going to talk about those in much detail, but I do want to ask Scott to unpack the income side of it, and then we'll come back to this slide and look at the net.
Thanks, Joe. So looking at kind of the breakdown on the slide, what you'll see is that approximately 20 million of that 24 million is coming directly from digital library subscriptions. And the vast majority of that, of course, is broken down into consortium sales, which are predominantly university groups that are buying together around the world. Individual corporations, there are approximately 100 largely mid-size and large-size tech companies, internet companies, the Microsofts, the Intels, the Apples and Googles. And then, of course, individual members of ACM representing about 1.8 million. And that number has been steadily decreasing over the years, while I would say the institutional and corporates have remained relatively flat. On the institutional side, we're selling into about 2,700 universities worldwide. And that's the number that's remained relatively constant over the years. Some years it goes up, some years it goes down, but it's relatively consistent around that number. On the fourth line, you'll see advertising. So this is not a large line item. It's about 1.2 million, but it is predominantly selling classified job ads, either through jobs.acm.org or through the classified section of the communications of the ACM. And that's a business that's relatively stable, but it goes up and down as well from year to year. So, you know, as I think many of you know, we're not really selling lots of glitzy car ads or any other kinds of ads in the magazine. So most of that revenue is really job related. Magazine subscriptions, ICPS. ICPS, which many of you know, is a non-proceedings series that we launched about 15 years ago. Probably the best way of thinking about ICPS is that it's a competitor to the Springer Lecture Notes in computer science. And that's a line item that is actually on the increase. And so we're starting to invest a little bit more in the growth of that series. But of course, journal subscriptions and open access revenue. One note about the OA revenue, which is predominantly hybrid OA fees that are author-selected APCs when authors want to open their articles in the DL. The actual top line is a bit higher than this, but as many of you know, we've publicized this heavily over the years, we actually give the vast majority of that money back to the library community as credits on their DL subscriptions. So while that line item grows, ACM actually only generates a small amount of that revenue, which we use predominantly to fund some of our gold open access titles and some of the embargo periods where we're transitioning from hybrid to gold. But still relatively small piece of the overall business. All of that adds up to the 24 million that you see on the screen.
Thanks, Scott. If you go back one slide for a minute to the one more, I just want to emphasize, now that you've seen expenses and income, the net. What we found was that ACM's making about $691,000 in 2019 total in publications. There are lots of numbers floating around that people, if you looked at the annual report, it would show a much larger number, but it wouldn't account for the cost of a lot of these things that are in here that aren't part of the publications department itself. Biggest of them, the digital library, but also a lot of the indirect costs that are in these categories, which is why we're going to go in and now break the 4 biggest categories down for you and go through them one by one. And why don't we start with Jack and journals?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks to everyone for, joining us today. And I hope everyone is well and safe and coping with the, disruptions in our everyday lives and work. So yeah, let's do a bit of a deep dive on the journals. And you can see, I mean, the kind of total expense here is about 4 million, and roughly the submissions category is, licenses for journal management. I mean, everybody's favorite, Manuscript Central from Scholar One. We also use a few journals, editorial manager from Aries. And so those are license fees in terms of accepting submissions and, contacting reviewers and that kind of thing. One of the, larger chunks is production. And this is, comprises things like copy editing, composition, and that's probably about 75% of that total. And then the other costs include DOIs for everything, every article, copyright, management and obtaining copyright and license, kind of the permissions that authors want. There's a license fee we use for Crossref, that checks for plagiarism. I think every EIC, before they parcel out a journal for review, runs it through Authenticate to make sure, there's no plagiarism. And I think, that's proved helpful to ACM in terms of we've not had any, major disasters where entire, journals have had to be retracted and or, issues have been retracted. And then there's printing and distribution. So people still, for journals, there are libraries and individuals that ask for hard copy. And so, the cost of, actually printing, and some of, the journals do, color. And so that's, can be expensive as well. And then the printing. The next, two items are, again, the kind of, the large part of this, and this is the, direct staff support. So these are, the people that are managing, the program, the journal manager and her staff. We have acquisition editor that works with the Pubs Board and groups there to develop new journals and get those launched. Each EIC has a traffic kind of professional manager who's skilled in the use of manuscripts, central and that kind of thing. So those are, kind of the staff there, and that's about 6.46 FTEs. And then the last item is kind of this overhead of staff and expenses, just in kind of managing, the publication. Probably somebody has to manage those, and includes things like rent, utilities, legal staff, accounting, in-house management, marketing. We market, journals, especially, new ones, to make them, make the community and others aware of them, the libraries, etc. So that's it. I mean, fairly, straightforward, although again, looking at the costs and understanding, kind of the staff level, the FTE level, supporting requires kind of delving into, looking at the processes and who's involved in the various stages. And I don't know if there are any questions here. We're going to, move on to magazines, but maybe this is a good point to stop.
Jack Claire has a question to ask.
Okay.
Hi there. A question was asked by Tom. Is the 690,000 is net income ?
Oh.
Net of all operating costs such as staff, etc. Does not sound like much at all in the overall scheme of a 23 million concern.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, that's net income. It's not a whole lot in the overall scheme of a $23 million concern. Part of that, very bluntly, is when we launched the digital library, it was a very conscious decision to price it so that lots of people could afford to subscribe for their institutions. And, we had a model for a long time where, people were paying from a few thousand to large institutions, maybe $10,000 a year, as opposed to some of our competitors who might be charging $50,000 or $100,000 for a similar number of publications being read. And we viewed that as a good thing. I don't think we were quite aware of just how fine a line we were cutting. Maybe the upper management was just being kind in letting us keep this model because they knew it was okay. But we're not in business to make money. We're in business to get our computing research and practice material out to the public. And I think as you see the rest of this, you'll see we invest a bunch of money in places where we think it has impact, but in turn, we run the rest of the things we do as leanly as possible.
I guess the other thing I'd say, I mean, I think we knew that, the prices we were charging were low. I mean, when we talked to the libraries and, the consortia that subscribed, the feedback we got is, hey, you guys are the good guys. They understood that, and especially compared to the commercial, publishers. And, we are a nonprofit and a scholarly publisher. But, consistently, that was kind of, the feedback we got from those. And that's why I think, people, especially as we move to this open access, are, interested and are willing to kind of move to that, because they do, especially when they see some of these numbers, understand that, yeah, we're not making a big profit here. That we are delivering a very high quality product at a very, very reasonable, cost.
Just to follow up to that, Tom was not meaning to be critical. He just wanted to be assured that all of our bills were being able to be paid. And another question, can we thus say that each paper costs about $4,000 US?
That's right. We're going to get to the kind of per article costs later, but yeah, and then you'll see that for the journals. Well, I think if you look, when we get there, it's about 1,700 total cost per article. But yeah.
It's going to vary pretty dramatically between publication type, as you're about to see on the next slide. Any other questions before we move to the next slide on magazines? So the magazines program, as you all know, is about 7 magazines. 4 of those magazines are both print and digital, and 3 are digital only. But it's a significant expense. And as I think many of you know, several of those magazines are sizable, both in terms of readership contribution to the digital library, in terms of usage, but just also in terms of the expense of running those. I didn't provide a breakdown by magazine title, but it is worth saying that the vast majority of these expenses come through communications of the ACM. That is by far the largest expense item here. Interactions, of course, is a little bit more expensive than some of the other magazines, but it is really CACM, which is a monthly magazine that's printed and distributed to about 60,000 individuals around the world. The other ACM members are, of course, getting digital versions of the magazine. And it's been, if you look at that line item of printing and distribution, which represents $1.4 million, it's been a constant discussion internally for years. Should ACM continue to print CACM and deliver that? And every year we do market research, we do readership studies, we do these religiously every year, and every year we hear the same thing, that the membership of ACM like getting that print magazine. They value it highly. In fact, it's one of the most highly valued things that ACM members get. And so, I can't speak for the future 5 years down the road whether we would continue to print. But as of now, that really is highly valued by the membership and the readership. So we're going to keep doing that. It's a sizable operation, to be sure. One of the things that sets, and you'll see when we get to the breakdown at the article level, that sets magazines apart. Of course, we're not publishing as many magazine articles as you do journals, certainly not conferences. But each article really involves a significant amount of effort. And actually, as I think Joe and Jack can attest to, over the last week, we've been working on this CACM article on pubs finances, and going back and forth with our creative designer, our graphic designer that does the layout and composition. You can see how much effort, manual labor goes into this. It's not as automated a process as we have with the journals and the conference proceedings. So it really is, it's something you have to invest heavily in if you want to keep doing a magazine program like we do. Why don't I do a pause and see if there are any questions specifically related to magazines?
Scott, this is Jeff. Just real quick, would you be willing to resend out the CACM article again to folks? We'll collect a list and some people that just hadn't received it.
Yeah, so absolutely, I'm happy to do that. The only caveat to that is there are probably 4 iterations of that article that have been done since we sent it out. It's changing multiple times a day as we kind of work on the editorial side. But I think the final version will be ready to go into production on Friday. So if you don't mind waiting until Friday, we'll send you kind of the clean final version that will appear in CACM.
Sounds great. Thank you.
I guess the other thing I'd say is that we've already gotten some feedback, from members that have, read it, and this group, and again, very appreciative things. This was exactly what we hoped, is to be able to kind of get this and get feedback from the SGB before, we published it in CACM, because I think, understanding this and getting it, right, and so that people can understand it's very important. So again, for those of you who've already sent feedback, thanks so much.
All right,
why don't we move forward to conferences, which at least some people here might have an interest in. Conference proceedings, nope, back one slide, please. No, the other way. There we go. So conference proceedings, 13,500 articles, by which we mean full-length articles, as opposed to, again, the abstracts, the panel summaries, and other things that also come in conference companions and in other spaces. In 2019, the single biggest cost to producing these that we've accounted for is the $3.5 million that gets distributed back from the DL revenue to the SIGs. That $3.5 million we view as an essential part of the publications program. It allows you to have the financial confidence to invest in conferences. It allows you to have the financial cushion to run the conferences the way that's best. It's been historically the thing that has helped keep smaller SIGs available at scale and allowed larger SIGs to invest in programs for students, for internationalization. It's a wonderful thing, but it's money that comes straight out of the subscription revenue and gets returned back to the SIGs to spend. And we want to be clear about that, because we don't want to have that thought of as being double counted. That's part of publications that we then turn back to you to spend. After that, our two biggest production expenses are just under $600,000 that we spend every year on conference reviewing software systems. It won't surprise any of you involved in this that we support a lot of them, providing the funding to Easy Chair and Hot Crap and Precision Conference, and I'm going to miss a couple of the good ones along the way, but to a bunch of these systems that make them accessible in most cases at no charge for our conferences, because we've paid for that already as a cost. Another $660,000 this year was spent on services compiling and producing proceedings, about $40,000 on plagiarism detection, DOI registration, other kinds of publication support. So that gives you the total that gets you to 4.7 some odd million dollars. The staff for conferences is remarkably lean. We're not counting SIG services staff here. We view them as being the people who are engaged in the operations of the conferences and not the publication side of it. And it's just over 2 people that are focused on production and rights management and all those other things. Some days we worry it's a little too lean, but other days we're real happy with the technology that enables us to make those people amazingly productive with the systems that allow our production to come to place. Overhead, staff, expenses, a little under $500,000. That includes rent, utilities, in-house management, all the same useful things that you've heard in the previous one, and that all coming together is $5.5 million. Roughly $2 million of things that are spent outside of putting money in the hands of SIGs to cover investing in publications. Scott, well, maybe we should pause for questions if they're there, but then Scott, I'll ask you to take us through the digital library costs.
So we have a few questions. Will a preprint of the article be available to send out to membership?
Oh. Scott, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Great question. We hadn't actually thought about doing a preprint. Joe, Jack, I mean, I'm happy to do so. I wonder if, you know, the cycle is that it would hit the article itself would hit the May issue, which comes out typically around the 26th or 27th of April. So I'm going to leave that decision up to Joe and Jack as co-authors on whether they want to do a preprint and put that out there.
Yeah, let us take a little time to figure that out. We hadn't thought about it. Mostly, I want to figure out the logistics of whether we'll be ready to respond to the feedback that comes from members in that time frame. If the articles, you know, if we're doing it really quickly, we thought of this as the way to reach members, but we'll give it some thought and we'll get back to you.
Okay, one more question. If we support Easy Chair, can we expect premium support for ACM conferences without paying extra?
I don't know what the specific contract we have is. And if there's somebody on the call who knows that, that's great. Otherwise, we'll wait for somebody who has those details to weigh in with exactly what we're providing.
Okay, follow up, maybe an online appendix with the additional data. I guess that's a follow up to the preprint question.
With what additional data?
I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, well, we'll look. I mean, there's a couple things we're providing for you here that we're not sure.
Individual magazine, I'm sorry.
Oh. We will think about that. I'm not sure it's a useful exercise to break this down by magazine for the membership. I think every magazine we have is very different in its nature. Which ones are paid for by subscription, which ones are given out to membership. Some of them are coming out 4 times a year online and others 12 times a year in print. So I'm not sure that's a useful breakdown for the purposes this article was put together for. But we'll take all the suggestions and discuss them after we're done with this this virtual meeting.
Okay, that's it for now.
All right. So I'm going to move to digital library expenses, starting with that top line item, which is called infrastructure. About half of that number, it's actually just under 1.2 million, goes to Adipon. As you know, on January 1st, we launched a completely new digital library, took a different approach with the DL by working with an external vendor by the name of Adipon. And so Adipon is essentially working very closely with Wayne Graves and the IS staff at headquarters on development efforts and the like. But when we look at those infrastructure costs, they include things like Akamai Technologies, Scholarly IQ, so things like, for example, reporting counter-compliant usage statistics to library customers, including all of the various sort of technologies, Cloudflare, Mailroute, enterprise database technologies, all adding up to that 2.6. Value-added services is a completely different category. Think of this in terms of metadata being added to the content as it flows from the production system into the platform itself. So within that value-added services of about $500,000, you're looking at everything from tagging of the content, metadata, production work going from Aptara that is really not so much on the text as much as on the metadata side, working with vendors like Parity and PTI, and all of those things that make the content in the digital library discoverable. Content preservation is essentially two main things. As I think most of you will know, we back up all of the content in the digital library with two third-party services. One is called Portico, and the other one is called Clocks. Clocks is an acronym for lots of copies, keeps stuff safe. And it's a distributed model. These are nonprofits that are out there that work with thousands of publishers to ensure that if there's ever a discontinuation of the service, if ACM were ever to shutter its doors, that all of that content would continue to be made available to the community, however unlikely that is, of course. And then, of course, all of the staff, the direct and support staff figures going into this. This is largely from the IS department, where they're spending a lot of time on the development work, working closely hand in hand now with Adipon on new features and functionality for the digital library. All of that adds up to a significant amount. And, you know, of course, this is another example of a service that is very much sought after and highly appreciated by the community as well as our users. If at some point down the road, ACM were to decide that it didn't need those kinds of services, of course there are opportunities to reduce costs. But today the membership and the institutional customer base value the DL highly and have for many years, and so. That's an expense that ACM is committed to investing in the future.
Great. So why don't we pull this just together in one slide that you'd asked earlier about per article, what do things cost? And, you know, recognizing that this is simplifying down to the full article size things that are going on, not all the other stuff that gets deposited in the digital library. And I should say with that, we're not including any of the cost of maintaining the decades of past work. We're assuming each year is sort of pay as you go, just to make it simpler to do the analyses. The cost per article for ACM Proceedings is just over $700. Journals are substantially more expensive to a large extent because of the costs that come in with copy editing, with greater support for journal editors. Frankly, SIGs do a lot of work with volunteers in an amazing way in the conference series, but they make the cost way lower than we can do with journals and editors and editorial boards. And magazine articles are over $8,000 an article. You know, it's interesting to look at that number, but then turn around and say these 675 articles represent 33% of all of the download and read behavior in the digital library. It's an interesting balance to go back and forth between what does it cost to produce it and where does that production result in an investment that pays off for our larger community. We're not trying to resolve that. We're just trying to put the information out there for you to see. Then if we'll go forward, I just want to give you a few thoughts about where things are going next, and then take the rest of people's questions and comments.
Joe, can I just add 2 points relating to this? It's very hard to compare when you look at magazines, journals, and conference proceedings, to compare whether those numbers are high or low, and whether, you know, it's even fair to compare them against each other. When you look at some of the big sort of comparable types of magazines that we've modeled CACM off of in the past, it's really Science and Nature. And I know anecdotally, one of the reasons why Nature magazine has had a really hard time moving to an APC open access model is because the cost of the APC would be so high. And I've heard, informally, I've heard that number is well over $10,000 to $15,000 an article. And when you look at the infrastructure, we from time to time had an opportunity to go down to Washington, D.C. and meet with the AAAS Science magazine staff. The infrastructure that those organizations maintain to run those magazines is it's enormous in comparison. So I think even when I compare against Nature or Science, I think we're actually still on the inexpensive side in terms of kind of per article comparisons. Second point I wanted to make is that it's not a coincidence that the $709 ACM Proceedings price or the $1,700 price for journals correlates very closely to the APCs that we established way back in, I think it was April of 2013, when we first introduced hybrid OA. We did that analysis internally and figured out that that's roughly what it costs. Over that time, our costs go up in general. Things tend to move up over time. But also at the same time, headquarters staff are always looking to reduce costs. So we do RFPs, we go out to multiple vendors, we make sure that we're getting good costs from production vendors and print vendors and the like. So where some of those APCs would ordinarily go up over time, we've managed to keep the costs relatively stable, and we'll continue to do that.
Great, thank you. We can go to the next slide. I'm going to take questions. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Claire.
Okay, a few questions. Jessica suggests that we might have a serious PR problem, given that looking at the ACM annual report appears to tell a very different story than what is being presented here. I know that members have been discussing this at length on social media after ACM signed the embargo letter, and not very favorably. Two questions come out of this. One, how can the SIG leadership help get the correct story out there? And two, can the ACM annual report be revamped, perhaps going backward, to show that pubs are not a big profit center for ACM?
So the long answer to the ACM annual report question is one we're not the right people to answer. And if some of those right people want to weigh in, they can. As somebody who's run nonprofits, I can tell you that there are certain accounting standards that you have to write to. And I think the interesting question is not so much, can we change that, but can we put these functional reports into what we issue annually? And I know part of what the EC has been discussing is putting this out annually as some form of a report to membership on what we're doing with publications, and that will probably get coupled with our progress towards open access. And that might be a way to help. As far as getting your help in getting the word out, once this comes out, we would love to see SIG leaders sharing this, commenting on it. One day we will again have conferences that happen face-to-face and maybe even having discussions about it. But getting this word out in your newsletters to help people understand. I think you're absolutely right, Jessica, that people don't know what goes into stuff, and it's not different from pubs than it was for conferences. I've had all sorts of people who didn't understand why a conference needs to cost more than $100 a day, and until you explain it to them and show them the items, they don't realize what they're getting for that dollar.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Joe, that the reason we decided to do the article in CACM was, on the one hand, to respond to those kinds of comments and any confusion that was out there in kind of the membership base. There have been blogs that have been written in recent months. We've actually responded to many of those online. Once we had these numbers kind of to present in this format, we've also, within headquarters staff, been doing webinars with many of our institutional customers who have asked the same kinds of questions, who've looked at annual reports and who have expressed those same concerns. I personally wouldn't be a big fan of going back retroactively and redoing numbers. I think, sure, you could do that, but I think the amount of effort required to do that versus the benefit, it just isn't there. I'm also taking into consideration we're pretty lean staff, and these are trying times. But certainly going forward, presenting it in a way that really tells a very realistic picture, realistic story, and gives a very clear picture of what those numbers are. So, we want to be transparent. I hope this entire exercise shows that our willingness to put all of that into a magazine that's going out to 100,000 individuals is another example of that. And from those who have already seen the numbers, both within membership and outside the membership, there's really a positive feeling that ACM is doing far more than, let's say, other societies or other publishers are doing on this front.
Okay, another question from Claudia. Why single out preservation costs? Incredibly cheap considering digital preservation costs everywhere.
Scott, do you want to handle this one?
Sure, yeah, and actually the $18,000 figure, it's actually the real number is about 30. I looked at some of the contracts that we have with Portico and Clocks yesterday. The 18,000 is because we've historically, the contracts are kind of in the middle of the year, and so it included one of those contracts, but the other one didn't make it in. So the number is about $10,000, $12,000 higher than that. Digital preservation is an important thing for many of our institutional customers, making sure that there is a backup preserve. And so we just thought breaking it out, just showing people that there is a tangible cost to doing that work. It's not simply vendor costs. Also, it requires effort from staff to make sure that we're getting data feeds out and we're working through any technology changes that happen with those vendors. Yeah, the reason we put it there as a broken out expense was really because of the institutional customers who wanted to see what we were spending on those lines.
Okay, one more question from Tom. He writes, so my publication is classified as a newsletter, even though it's a prestigious juried publication in MIS. Does the cost per article for my newsletter reconcile with the proceedings costs? Our production takes place in your proceedings shop at Sheridan, so I'm thinking so.
So you're asking a question that we didn't go into the level of analysis to give you a detailed answer to. You're probably right that it probably is somewhere in that ballpark, but I don't want to tell you we know what it would cost without real analysis behind it. And there are, at this point, a relatively small number of newsletters that publish full-length research papers, and we didn't think that was one of the topic categories to do analysis on.
Yeah,
sorry, do you know how many newsletters fall under that category?
37.
I mean, that publish
that have full-length research papers.
Oh, no, we don't know. We don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, but knowing how prestigious it is, we would be happy to raise the per article APC up to the 1700 level if that would make the community feel that was a sign of quality. Please don't write, that was a joke. No. Good.
I mean, I think it's so the numbers, you can be assured that the numbers are included in the expenses here. I don't see them broken out on the sheets in front of me, but I think that they're in. The numbers are small enough that we kind of lumped it all together as opposed to breaking it out separately. It's simply, there's also ACM books, which is another very small line item of series that comes into those DL figures that are broken out, but it's under the DL institutional figures. Those numbers are kind of a rounding errors, which is why we didn't break them out separately.
Yeah, and as these things get bigger in the future, or as our tools for allocating get better, future years we may be able to break them down better.
Okay, we're all set to move on
into the wind up here. Looking ahead, I'm going to take this backwards and end with the how we compare. If we think about what our model is, everything we've told you is based on today's model, where libraries subscribe in order to give their patrons access to read the content in the DL. And while open access is growing, it's still a relatively small share of the total digital library. Growing every year, we think that's a valuable thing. Content is also open increasingly because of government mandates. But in the future, what we're pushing towards, and what some of you have read announcements from some major institutions and ACM about is a model where institutions pay based on articles their patrons or their employees author and make their content open from day one to the world. The intent here is to produce the same revenue, but mostly concentrated from a smaller number of institutions that are publishing, with the institutions that publish infrequently or never either accepting what they get for free or perhaps paying small fees for some of the services that are layered on top of the core content. The critical factor in all of that is getting institutions to feel that they get good value by publishing with ACM, which means keeping up the evidence of impact, that our papers get cited, that our papers get downloaded, that our papers get read, that our papers get used. And so as you think about the cost and revenue drivers going forward, the critical things that we see going forward, number one is always going to be number of publications. Part of the reason we've been able to keep costs relatively stable is that as inflation drives certain costs up, we gain economies of scale with the increase in publications that happens as we start new journals, as we start new conferences, as some of our conferences grow. That doesn't mean some things won't shrink. That's the nature of the field. But on average, if we grow our publications, we grow our ability to do these things at a relatively stable cost. The mix of types of publications that we have are going to be a cost driver. We're very interested in figuring out how to get research into use. We've launched a couple of new research and practice journals, specifically in the areas of digital threats and digital government. We're watching to see how they go. We're also watching to see where their cost lines fall as they sit somewhere between traditional journals and magazines in the ways that they create content, and whether the impact that they have on the field justifies the investment. Finally, we're looking at new features that we know are important to the community. Features that support deposits of code and data, support for replicability in its various forms, from making artifacts available to creating simulation environments, and all sorts of other things that come in new ways of keeping the reviewer community engaged, rewarded, and all the rest of that. We're not here just to look at the numbers. We're also here to keep the quality ever improving and the experience for the authors, the readers, and the reviewers and volunteers ever improving. Having said that, I want to end this piece with just a quick look at how ACM compares. This first slide, and this is really what you have in the article, is what we knew, say, as of 2 or 3 days ago, which is informally, we knew our staff was a lot smaller than that of peer societies. Now, we're really thrilled that Scott has, connections to our peers in a number of societies, and we were able to put numbers on that. And this is the publications numbers. If you look at, we're publishing about 26,000 articles a year. Well, Scott, why don't you take us through this, because you got us these numbers.
And let me just add one comment on the ACM Open, Joe. We're giving kind of regular webinars now to institutions that have expressed interest in this new model. And we could spend an entire hour walking the SGB or council through the details of that model, which have an enormous amount of data about where our articles are being published from, what institutions they're affiliated with, where revenue comes from. And so if that's of interest, we can certainly schedule another time to go into a lot more detail so you can understand how that model works. I think that may be important for some people to understand. So let me just give you the acronyms. AIP is the American Institute of Physics, AMS is the American Mathematical Society, and ACS is, of course, the American Chemical Society. These are from conversations that I've had with the heads of publishing for each of these different societies. They're, as you can imagine, they're a little reluctant to give a lot of detail. They actually don't provide any of this information even at this level in their annual reports, to my knowledge. They report the same way that we do in terms of kind of high-level financials for nonprofit organizations. But I think it's still enough information to get a sense of what it takes to run a high-quality, well-respected publication program in a nonprofit environment. AMS is actually, I don't know their actual surplus. I get the sense their surplus is probably a little bit more than ACM's from my discussions with their director of publications, but so it's probably in the 19 to 20 million or so on the expense line. But they're running an enormous staff, and many of those staff are based onshore in the United States, in Providence, Rhode Island, and elsewhere. They run their own printing presses at AMS, which I found fascinating. AIP is about twice our size in terms of revenue, but very similar in terms of the number of articles. And just to speak to a point Joe made at the beginning of this talk, when we look at other organizations and how they price their information, AIP is generally considered by the institutional marketplace as a reasonably priced publisher, nonprofit publisher. And yet they are on a per article basis about twice as expensive, more than twice as expensive as ACM. So really when you look at cost per article, average cost per article, we really are extremely competitive. I haven't found any other publishers or societies that are less expensive. There's a blank space in between AMS and ACS. I was hoping to get information from the IEEE. Unfortunately, not able to do that, but we'll keep trying to get some comparables. Maybe somebody on the list of attendees has more information. But in general, when we say we're running a lean staff to run ACM publications, this is a good group to compare against.
Okay, and we've come to the end of the time we've invited you for. You've had questions along the way. We have time for another question or two if people have them. And otherwise, we do want to thank you once again for taking the time out to do this. Wish you safety in your relative isolation and comfort as you connect to people online.
I don't see any additional questions posted, so I think we might be all set.
So just to let folks know, our face-to-face scheduled meeting that was going to be held, it has been canceled. We will be following up with another likely Zoom session. One of those things that, just to let you know, we will be discussing is going to be what's happening with cancellation of conferences and how ACM is addressing that and some of those pieces. And again, we'll be looking at some other details that should come out within the next week or two about our next follow-up Zoom meeting.
Jeff, we do have one more question from Claudia, who raised her hand, but I don't think we're using that feature today. So I'm asking her to type her question here.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are these personnel only publication personnel? Oh, are these personnel only publication personnel? That's the question.
I think she's referring to the comparisons we're having. Did we include our overhead FTEs, and did the other organizations? Scott, do you?
So to the extent, so for ACM, I mean, within the numbers that we've presented, yes, we've broken down what we're effectively calling direct and support staff and then overhead staff and expenses. So if you look at those line items for what we've shared, then we've presented that. I don't have that level of detail from the other publishers. The only detail that I have was from AMS, that they had, I think out of the 120, it was 80 full-time staff and 40 additional non-pub staff from the society that are contributing to publications. I don't have that level of breakdown from the other societies.
Okay. That's it.
All right, thanks everyone. We appreciate you joining us today.
Bye.
Yep.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Yep.